I'm here with Colonel John Eidsmoe, who is a constitutional attorney, author, pastor, lecturer, and law professor. He's a really knowledgeable guy, and we're going to ask him some questions. Colonel Eidsmoe, thank you for taking the time to be with us. So I think one of the biggest problems in America today is we're having a hard time seeing where jurisdiction lies and who's sovereign in our nation. A lot of people think man is sovereign. A lot of people think the state is sovereign. But we've gotten to the point now where the state is saying who should educate our children and what marriage is, and we're really mixed up with who is sovereign. What do you think the remedy is for us to go back and to say, okay, this is who our main appeal is to, this is who ultimately is sovereign? Is it government? Is it man? Is it God? People will say, well, what about the separation of church and state? How do we handle that? What do you think is the best way to approach that?
Well, you've asked about 40 questions in one, I'd say there, but let's begin by looking at the Declaration of Independence, which begins by saying that we are entitled to be an independent nation by the laws of nature and of nature's God.
Right.
Recognizing that there is a higher authority than man, and it is God's law, ultimately, that establishes the nation. Now, if God is in charge, and really, in a sense, you could even say that the term sovereignty should only be used of God and not really of anybody else, because whatever sovereignty anybody in government has is really a delegated sovereignty from the only one who is truly sovereign. But God has established various institutions to govern us, divine institutions as we call them, one being the church, one being the state, and one being the family. And you could possibly look at it as these three institutions, or you could say two kingdoms, church and state, and the family being the unit that is between the individual in both church and state. But at any rate, God has given certain responsibilities to the family, certain responsibilities to the state, and certain to the church. And what I think we need to understand when we're looking at church and state is, I don't think very many of us want a state church. I don't want the government running the church, and I don't really want the church running the government. But when you think about it, the first society in history that ever practiced a separation of church and state that I can see is Old Testament Israel. Because there you see the kings, the civil authority coming out of the tribe of Judah, the priests, the religious authority coming out of the tribe of Levi, separate offices, separate functions, but they're both under God and both under the law of God. And understand the role of these two institutions, that the role of the state is to defend the borders, to keep the streets safe, and protect our rights. The role of the church is to preach the word of God. And these complement each other. They're not in opposition. If the church is doing its job properly of instructing people in salvation and good Christian character, they're going to produce law-abiding citizens. And that's going to make it a lot easier for the state to do its job. If the state is doing its job properly and keeping the streets safe, that makes it easier for the church to do its job in preaching the gospel. So church and state, properly understood, really function together and complement each other. But each has its own distinct role, and we need to keep those roles distinct.
I think that's a great point. Shifting gears a little bit, one of the main problems I think we have is lack of understanding of the Constitution. So many people don't understand our organic law. They don't even know what organic law is. And the scriptures say that my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. What do you think the remedy is for our culture? Is it understanding the Constitution more? Should we be studying that more? And is it people say it's the greatest political document ever. What's your take on that?
That it's the greatest political document ever, I would agree, but that doesn't mean it's the first thing we need to be studying. Far more important than that is to study the Word of God. And it is from the Word of God that the founders understood and derived principles of government. You could look to the delegates to the convention there, where you see that they come out of various church backgrounds. About 28 are Episcopalian, which is Church of England, a Orthodox conservative church at that time. About 8 are Presbyterians, 7 Congregationalists, and so on. But they come out of a religious background, and they get their ideas out of the Bible. And those are the bases for writing a constitution. 2 basic principles that probably unite them is, 1, a higher view of God and his law. The idea there's a higher law of God that human law must conform to. And the other would be a low view of man and his nature, an understanding that we're sinners, that we have original sin, or if you follow Luther and Calvin, we go even beyond that to total depravity. And that has a lot of implications for government. For one thing, it means that we can't live in anarchy. It means that we have to have government to keep our sinful nature in check. Government is going to take away sin, only Christ can do that. But government can keep sin nature in check by persuading us that crime doesn't pay. And anyway, but here's the other problem with that. Those who run the government have the same sinful nature as everybody else.
Right.
And that being the case, we can't trust them with too much power. It's like Lord Acton says, power tends to corrupt, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so, how do we give government enough power to govern effectively? But at the same time, restrain that power so it does not become tyrannical and oppressive. That's what the delegates to the convention wrestled with, and their answer to it was the United States Constitution. And several of the principles there, sometimes I call these principles the Founding Fathers' five-fold formula for freedom. But number one, the idea of government have limited delegated powers. Government has only the power that we the people have delegated to it in the Constitution and no others. All others are reserved to the states or to the people. Secondly, that we separate those powers into levels, first of all, federal, state, and local, and branches horizontally, that is, legislative, executive, and judicial. We have checks and balances among those levels and branches. We have rights that are reserved to the individual. The framers didn't create a pure democracy. They created a republic in which the majority generally runs things, but the minority has certain rights that even the majority can't take away, like the right of free exercise of religion or the right of freedom of speech. And then finally, responsibility through religion. The framers had a great respect for religion, and when they spoke of religion, they usually used that term pretty much interchangeably with Christianity. But while they didn't want a state church, they understood that Christianity will play a civic role by creating the kind of moral self-discipline, the kind of moral character that makes responsible self-government possible. It's like John Adams said, that our country, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people.
Absolutely.
It is wholly inadequate for the government of any other. So, yes, the answer is the Constitution, but first of all, recognize the Constitution is based on the Bible.
Absolutely. And I love how you laid out that the Constitution gets a lot of its ideas from the scriptures. But in the last 100 years, we've really seen government grab onto a lot of things they should never have a hold of. The Department of Education. Now we have the government saying how we should educate our children. The government saying what marriage is. I think the Founding Fathers would roll over in their graves if the government's making a claim on marriage. How do you think we got to this point? How did culture change? And what other worldviews have combated with Christianity to get us where we are now?
Well, part of what's happened is we've gotten away from an absolute view of truth. And with an absolute view of truth, you had an absolute view of law as well, and an absolute view of the meaning of words, and therefore the meaning of the Constitution. And even though you find some dispute among the Founding Fathers, for example, Alexander Hamilton wants to interpret the Constitution as giving broad powers to the federal government. James Madison and Thomas Jefferson want to interpret it as giving more narrow powers to the federal government, but they both agreed that it is the wording of the Constitution that ultimately governs the question here. But gradually we've gotten away from the idea that there is absolute truth. You know, Hegel with his dialectic, and Darwin with his evolution, and then as we move into the postmodern and so on, the idea that words themselves do not have any fixed meaning, rather it is up to individuals to deconstruct words and give them whatever meaning they want. Now, when you're just talking in ordinary conversation, or when you're producing a play or something like that, that is a little scary, but probably not earth-shaking, but when you have judges thinking that words can mean whatever they want them to mean, then it gets dangerous. And anyway, so the idea then that the words of the Constitution don't have a fixed meaning, we've all heard this phrase, the living Constitution, and it sounds attractive, but what it really means is a silly, putty Constitution that anyone can shape, any judge, that is, can shape to mean anything that judge wants it to mean. And that's a dangerous concept, because the same court that can read rights into the Constitution that aren't there can also read rights out of the Constitution that are there, and can read government powers into the Constitution that aren't there. And education, as you say, there's a classic example. The Constitution gives the federal government no power whatsoever over education, with the exception of military training. Beyond that, it leaves it to the states, or ideally to the people.
Absolutely. I think the bottom line is what you were talking about with the changing of words. He who controls language controls politics. And I think we're really seeing that in our culture today. Colonel Eidsmoe, thank you for your time.
And thank you. Excellent interview.
Awesome.